I think I'm live. Test 1, 2, 3. Oh my god. I'm live. All right, let's see. Let me make sure I'm actually live. Because today I am live. Yes, okay. Today I have something special planned. I know this is my first stream in quite a while. Things have been I've been moving around a lot. I drove cross country. Well, I flew back to Massachusetts and then I drove cross country. I stopped in DC briefly. And since then, I've been vaccinated. I've started doing organizing. I just got a job doing social media management. Um, and yeah, all sorts of stuff. Some stuff I'm not ready to talk about and hopefully will at some point within the near future. But today, we will be reading a chapter of this incredible book, The Management of Savagery. Which is the management of savagery, how America's national security state fueled the rise of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Donald Trump by Max Blumenthal. Now, we're going to basically, I was doing a little thinking, and I decided that it would be best to sort of go straight to the afterword. And because I feel that this chapter is going to probably, it's the most contemporary. Let's say that it's the most excuse me. It's definitely by far the most contemporary chapter. So I feel like a lot of the people who may decide to watch this, if they're still up, I know that this is kind of late. This is very understandable. It's not like a bunch of obscure knowledge woven into like an in-depth investigative book, which is what this is. As you can see, like at the end, it's crazy. There's like pages and pages and pages of citations. It's absolutely insane, this book. So I'm gonna read, a few reviews from the back, just to get people hyped up, hopefully. So Max Blumenthal has spent the last decade transforming himself into one of the most vital voices in journalism today, always speaking the truth to power with fearlessness and integrity. And that was by Reza Aslan, who some of you may recognize, and one of the finest and most intrepid journalists working in America today. Wow, that is a hell of a compliment. And also true. And that review is from Andrew Cockburn, who was the author of Kill Chain. And Reza Aslan is the author of Zealot, but he also does other things on Twitter and such. Then this review by Juan Cole, who is the author of The New Arabs and Engaging the Muslim World, says Max Blumenthal audaciously takes in-your-face, on-the-ground journalism into the realm of geopolitics. And the last review by the most recognizable name of them all, Oliver Stone. Looking for honest journalism, read Max Blumenthal. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to give you some honest journalism, some stuff that other people won't talk about that Max Blumenthal will. So afterward, active measures. I guess we should just jump right into this, as I always try to do. Okay. I hope everyone can hear me just fine. It seems that that is the case. Okay. The election of Donald Trump triggered a moral panic about foreign meddling and supplied America's security state with a convenient and familiar national enemy to replace the evildoers of the so-called war on terror. You know what? I'm sorry. I have to take this cover off because it's getting in my way. So, the election of Donald Trump triggered a moral panic about foreign meddling and supplied America's security state with a convenient and familiar national enemy to replace the evildoers of the so-called war on terror. Trump's anti-interventionist posturing on the campaign trail, his lambasting of Bush's wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, his stated refusal to arm Syrian, quote, moderate rebels, his suspicion of NATO. We can't be suspicious of NATO on any of these platforms that I'm streaming on. Anyways, his apparent interest in detente with Russia and a promise of buffoonish reality show star and the promise of a buffoonish reality show star as the captain of America's empire. All of this, no matter how disingenuous, Trump's anti-interventionist appeals might have had endangered a wild hysteria among foreign policy elites, joining with the dead enders of Hillary Clinton's campaign, who were desperate to deflect from their crushing loss. The mandarins of the national security state worked their media contacts to generate the narrative of Trump-Russia collusion. Out of the post-election despair of liberals and national security elites, the furor of Russiagate was born. Okay. Then, what's good, Nate, man? Oh man, I miss you, dude. Next time I'm in DC, we gotta get it going. The national outrage substituted Russia for ISIS as the country's new folk devil and painted Trump as Russian President Vladimir Putin's Manchurian candidate. Rather than assailing Trump as imperious, bigoted, as the imperious, bigoted oligarch he was, the established opposition dusted off the phantasmagoria of the McCarthy era to brand the president as a Russian sleeper agent and, quote, the Russians as a singular source of evil, and just the historical practices of the Russians, who typically are almost genetically driven to co-opt, this is a quote, to co-opt, penetrate, gain favor, whatever, which is a typical Russian tactic, declared James Clapper, the then director of the National Intelligence, DNI, director of the National Intelligence, yeah. In May 2017, comments channeling xenophobia, suddenly cursing through the Democratic Party political veins. By uniting against a foreign evil that supposedly controlled the White House, liberals had unwittingly become infected with the same tendency exhibited by right-wing Tea Party activists who had sought to cast Obama as a crypto-Muslim with no American birth certificate. Almost overnight, hundreds of thousands of liberals were showing up at post-election rallies with placards depicting Trump in Russian garb and surrounded by Soviet hammer and sickle symbols. Typical of the phantasmagoria of the liberal resistance was a giant, quote, projection above the Apple Store near the Manhattan gay mecca of Chelsea that portrayed a shirtless Putin lovingly embracing a pregnant, effeminate Trump. Complemented with the hashtag, quote, hashtag love through the hate, the image conveyed the sense that Putin and Trump were gay together, and that Trump was the bottom in the relationship. That's pretty, for like liberal rhetoric. I mean, whatever happened to like the embracing these values of like progressivism? I guess that goes out the window when Russia's involved. Anyway, for the first time in history, a majority of registered Democrats told pollsters that they believed Americans should fight and die to defend NATO members like Latvia from a hypothetical Russian invasion. With the strange and sudden transformation of the Democrats into a paranoid war party, a quiet neoconservative campaign set into motion over a decade before it was realized. This book began in Afghanistan, where the CIA weaponized political Islam to stop the spread of socialism in Central Asia and bleed the Soviet Union from its soft underbelly. The defeat of the Soviets, suffered at the hands of the US-backed Mujahideen, left a deep psychological scar that weakened their national resolve at an elemental level. When the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of economic pressure from without and within, Washington poured salt on the fresh wounds of the newly formed Russian Federation. Not only did the administration of President George H.W. Bush declare victory in the Cold War, effectively taunting a fallen foe, it began expanding NATO's military tentacles eastward in a clear abrogation of verbal agreements with the deposed Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. The goal was clear: to encircle the largest and most military powerful nation in Eurasia and gradually transform it into a toothless, economically dependent vassal of the United States. Now, we've seen that happen with countless countries. During the 1990s, Russia witnessed the wholesale looting of its state assets by, quote, the Harvard Boys, a collection of neoliberal American economists dispatched by President Bill Clinton's administration to oppose, quote, shock therapy privatizations under the watch of the then Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers. A new class of oligarchs blossomed while millions of Russians lost their pensions and public benefits, resulting in 3 million excess deaths. Twice as many citizens as Russia lost during World War I. Diseases like diphtheria and tuberculosis, which had been wiped out under Soviet rule, experienced a resurgence, while HIV/AIDS spread like wildfire, driven by heroin imported from Afghanistan, where the Soviet-backed government had been replaced by a collection of warlords armed by the CIA. Life expectancy among Russian men immediately declined by 5 years, while grandmotherly babushkas saw their life savings disappear. Quote, many hung around for a while, wandering around town, wrote journalist Paul Klebennikov, who was later murdered for his work exposing Russian crime syndicates. Quote, the men become drunks sprawled at the icy gutter. The women become bone-thin ladies begging at the entrance of churches. Then they died. The younger generation had turned its back on its elders and allowed them to perish. By the end of the tenure of Boris Yeltsin, the vodka-sodden American-installed president, Russia's poverty rate had risen from 2% to a staggering 40%, an economic collapse worse than that of the American Great Depression, worse than that of America during the Great Depression, rather. The carefully managed harvest of death and economic devastation should have stood alongside of some of the most titanic crimes in the 20th century. In Washington, however, the looting was celebrated in reams of op-eds as, quote, free market reform and, quote, liberalization, whilst its catastrophic consequences were only quietly acknowledged in scarcely read official reports. Quote, by pursuing a policy of reform that required political victory of their reformers by whatever means necessary, the administration undermined the democratic process itself, end quote. A 2000 U.S. congressional report on the Clinton administration's Russia political policies concluded, foreshadowing the era of Yeltsin's hand-picked successor, Vladimir Putin. Papa Vlade. No, he's not my dad. The report also found that, quote, millions of U.S. taxpayer dollars provided directly to Clinton's hand-picked shock therapists from agencies like USAID, quote, would be unaccounted for. Though Putin was cut from the same privatizing cloth as Yeltsin, he embodied the experience of a KGB man who had witnessed the nation's tragic collapse from the inside. He valued stability above all else and entered the Kremlin determined to impose it on his country by any means necessary. The project of national revival entailed a crackdown on the oligarchs who defied his model of state-centered capitalism, as well as an array of internal political threats through sometimes less than savory methods. By 2007, the Russian economy was on its way to recovering from the crisis imposed on it during the 1990s. The country's national security apparatus had clearly recovered its confidence as well. That year, Putin delivered a touchstone address at the Munich Security Conference that skewered American interventionism as a driver of, quote, global destabilization. With the glowering Senator John McCain seated just feet away in the front row, Putin slammed, quote, illegitimate actions like the Iraq invasion for, quote, new human tragedies and creating new centers of tension. In Washington, the pressure for a confrontation with Putin's Russia was steadily building. In 2004, 3 years after the Bush administration's unilateral withdrawal from an anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia, a conglomeration of Iraq war neocons and liberal neoconserv a conglomeration of Iraq war neocons and liberal interventionists composed an open letter to EU and NATO leaders that slammed Putin for turning his back on the supposed achievements of the Yeltsin era, which, if you recall, we just discovered as being mostly disastrous. Continuing, published under the letterhead of the US-funded National Endowment for Democracy. Of course. Democracy. Okay, so published under the US-funded National Endowment for Democracy's Journal of Democracy. The letter was authored by neocon movement figureheads Robert Kagan and William Kristol. I think that's Bill Kristol, along with the then Senator Joseph Biden. Now, this book was written before Joseph Biden was president. It was also written by Madeleine Albright and Tom Malinowski. The latter then being the head of the Human Rights Watch. The head of the Human Rights Watch is now Ken Roth, and he is like a malignant sociopath. Continuing, its authors expressed anger that, quote, the instruments of state power appear to be being rebuilt. A clear reference to Putin's restoration of the Kremlin's control over national affairs at the expense of Western-friendly oligarchs like Boris Berezovsky, who later faced prosecution for their widespread theft of state resources. While Americans were transfixed by Bush's, quote, war on terror drama, a bipartisan coalition was quietly coalescing to confront the resurgent Russian menace. Dun, dun, dun. So-called color revolutions were spreading across Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, leveraging funds from the US-backed soft power NGOs like the National Endowment for Democracy, George Soros's Open Society Institute, and exiled oligarchs such as Berezovsky to topple governments in the former Soviet satellite states. Now, this is a fact about George Soros. I know people like to, get all up in arms whenever George Soros is criticized, but I am a Jew reading a book written by a Jew to you about a Jew who is a bad person. Those things can exist simultaneously without being anti-Semitic. Just, I know how up in arms we are about fake anti-Semitism these days. So, Mikhail Saakashvili, the president of Georgia, was one of Washington's favorite pet projects. One of his top advisors was Bruce P. Jackson, an American former military intelligence officer who helped found the Neoconservative Committee for the Liberation of Iraq. In 2008, with the back-channel approval from the then Vice President Dick Cheney, Saakashvili, I don't know how to pronounce all these things, I'm sorry. Ooh, that's a difficult one. Yeah, I think it's Saakashvili. Sent Georgian troops into the semi-sovereign Russian territory of South Ossetia, whatever. Claiming it as his own. His men were resoundingly clobbered in a punishing Russian counterattack. A humiliated Saakashvili was then seen chewing his tie in agony on national television as news arrived of his defeat. Congress erupted in bipartisan denunciation of Putin for having the chutzpah to repel a NATO ally's aggression. Across Russia, meanwhile, Putin's public approval rating soared. When President Obama attempted a diplomatic, quote, reset in 2009 with Putin's replacement, Dmitry Medvedev, he was met by an angry open letter from Foreign Policy Initiative, a rebranded version of Robert Kagan's PNAC that helped conceive the U.S. invasion of Iraq. For his part, Medvedev appeared so determined to repair the damaged relationship with the United States that when NATO was on the verge of intervening in Libya in 2011, Russia abstained on a UN Security Council vote by authorizing the Western military alliance to establish a no-fly zone. Putin was livid over the move, slamming it as capitulation. Quote, in Bill Clinton's times, Putin declared in comments aimed straight at Medvedev, quote, Yugoslavia and Belgrade were bombed. Bush sent armed forces into Afghanistan. A far-fetched and totally false pretext was used to invade Iraq, and the entire Iraqi leadership was eliminated. Even children in Saddam Hussein's family died. And now it's Libya's turn, under the pretext of protecting civilians. But it's the civilian population who dies during those airstrikes against Libyan territory. Where is the logic and the conscience? There is neither. That's a direct quote from Vladimir Putin. Putin's fury at his country's failure to obstruct yet another disastrous regime change operation helped propel his run for the presidency a year later. The chaos that had washed over Libya vindicated his warnings and sealed Medvedev's fate as a failed placeholder. The same year, Obama mocked his Republican opponent Mitt Romney for referring to Russia as America's top enemy. Quote, the 1980s are now calling, and they want their foreign policy back because the Cold War has been over for 20 years. Obama said in a widely applauded debate zinger. The Washington press corps shrugged off Romney's comments as a gaffe, unaware that his neoconservative foreign policy team was driving a campaign to turn his words into reality. 4 months before the presidential debate, and mostly before the radar of the national media, the Senate had effectively destroyed Obama's, quote, reset initiative with Moscow by passing the Magnitsky Act. The bill ushered in the first round of sanctions on Putin's inner circle and opened up the American attack on Russia's resurgent economy. Putin responded by banning American adoptions of Russian orphans. Unlike the United States, where Congress passed the Magnitsky Act unanimously and without debate, Putin's retaliation was met with consternation by some members of Russia's Duma. The sanctions had been generated thanks to the former Bill Browder, thanks to the fortune of former Bill Browder, a vulture capitalist hedge fund manager who cashed in on Russia's vast sell-off of public assets during the 1990s. Browder, who gave up his American citizenship to avoid paying taxes, turned to the Ashcroft Group, a high-flying lobbying firm run by right-wing former Attorney General John Ashcroft, to turn lawmakers like Democratic Senator Ben Cardin into de facto clients and ply members of the State Department. Years before, Browder had left his accountant, Sergei Magnitsky, to face the consequences after he bolted from the country to avoid paying $19 million in a USD in a civil tax judgment. While being held in prison, Magnitsky died from what Russian authorities said was cardiac arrest. Browder claimed his former bookkeeper had been beaten to death, incorrectly painting him as a whistleblowing lawyer who had exposed a $230 million theft by the Russian government. This is fascinating stuff. I hope whoever's listening is enjoying this as much as I am. A documentary film by Andrei Nekrasov. This sounds like a lot of things, actually. Andrei Nekrasov, a Russian dissident and noted critic of Putin, raised serious questions about whether Browder had concocted large parts of his story. While he posed as a courageous truth teller in testimony before Congress and on cable news networks, recasting what appeared to be a financial dispute into an international human rights drama, Browder fought with general success to ban screenings of Nekrasov's. I'm going to restart that. Browder fought with general success to ban screenings of Nekrasov's The Magnitsky Act behind the scenes. He even toiled to avoid telling his story under oath. Once fleeing on foot when he served was served with a subpoena in a case brought by one of the companies impacted by the Magnitsky sanctions. It was clear that one of the key architects of the new Cold War had much to hide. We're making good progress, I think. This is so fascinating. I have to keep going. This is great. By 2014, U.S.-Russia relations had reached a boiling point over Ukraine. The country's elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, had rejected, I think I'm saying that right, Yanukovych, had rejected an EU sanction. Sorry, I'm going to start that sentence over. I can't read sometime. Drop the link to the shirt. This shirt, my mother got this for me in Cuba ages ago. There's no link. Sorry. By 2014, U.S.-Russian relations had reached a boiling point over Ukraine. The country's elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, had rejected an EU Economic Association agreement that would have imposed harsh austerity on his country in favor of a more generous deal with neighboring Russia. Karl Gershman, a veteran neoconservative activist who served as chairman of the U.S. government-funded National Endowment for Democracy, NED for short, that had financed color revolutions across Europe, had argued a year before that, quote, Ukraine's choice to join Europe will accelerate the demise of the ideology of Russian imperialism that Putin represents. With Yanukovych siding with Russia, he threatened to prevent Washington from achieving what Gershman called, quote, the biggest prize, regime change in Moscow. Within months, another color revolution swept through Kiev, with millions in money from the NED and allied NGOs pouring into establish new opposition media outlets and mobilize activists. Obama's Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs in the State Department, Victoria Nuland, personally presided over the operation, marshalling a coalition of neoliberal technocrats and ultra-nationalist street muscle to drive out Yanukovych. Quote, we've invested over $5 billion, Nuland said, to, quote, help Ukraine achieve its European aspirations, end quote. Nuland happened to be the wife of Robert Kagan, the PNAC co-founder and former Romney advisor. She was so committed to the project of regime change in Ukraine that she appeared alongside then Ambassador Geoffrey Pyatt, to hand out cookies to protesters in Kiev's Maidan Square. That's ridiculous. Cookies? That's it? No AK-47s? Man, I feel like I was lied to. Quote, I think to help glue this thing and to have the UN help glue it and, fuck the EU, Nuland declared in a phone call to Pyatt. That's insane. Following the ouster of Yanukovych, Putin annexed the Ukrainian region of Crimea, where the mostly Russian-speaking population had voted in a referendum to join the Russian Federation. Fighting between pro-Russian separatists and the Ukrainian military, including the neo-Nazi Azov Battalion, incorporated into the country's National Guard, began in the eastern Donbass region, which remained contested and where both Russia and the Pentagon, Russia and the Pentagon, not Putin, quietly supplied assistance. Now, I have been talking about the Azov Battalion for like the past 3 months, and many people have been talking about it far before me. But I talk about the Azov Battalion a lot because they have this annual celebration celebrating the Nazi volunteer SS Galicia division that served voluntarily for the Nazis to exterminate Jews. And these are Nazi patch-wearing paramilitary, state-sanctioned, incorporated paramilitary people. They're fucking Nazis, and they serve at the behest of the Ukrainian state. So this is, this book directly references their involvement in the, the fight against, I guess, pro-Russian separatists. So, continuing, Nuland's machinations had plunged. Oh yeah, also I forgot to mention the journalist who just got had his plane pulled over, not really pulled over or grounded. That quote journalist that the Belarusians, Belarus president had, I guess it was the president, I don't know if it was actually the president, had grounded. He was an actual member of the Azov Battalion, so he was a Nazi, not a journalist, a State Department funded Nazi, and not a journalist. So, fuck that guy. Anyways, Nuland's machinations had plunged Ukraine into instability, and the EU association deal that the new pro-Western government in Kiev was compelled to sign wound up deepening the economic ruin. Excuse me. However, she had served the neoconservative agenda successfully, elevating the conflict they sought with Russia to new heights. The uproar over Russia's annexation of Crimea consolidated anti-Russian hostility across partisan lines in Congress and mobilized Cold War fever within the national security circles. Still, Bill Kristol, at the time, the U.S. Lamented at the time that the U.S. public had grown, quote, war weary and was not yet invested in a new confrontation. Quote, all that's needed is the rallying, end quote. He maintained, quote, and the turnaround can be fast, end quote. The moment would arrive amid the 2016 general election, when allegations of Russian hacking dominated headlines and triggered Democratic Party outrage. Before a packed hearing room in the Capitol's Longworth building on March 20th, 2017, just 2 months after Trump's inauguration, the Democratic Representative Adam Schiff distilled what had become the conventional wisdom in Washington into his opening remarks. With FBI Director James Comey seated before him as a witness, Schiff addressed the House Select Committee on Intelligence, quote, last summer at the height of a highly contested and bitterly adversarial presidential campaign, a foreign power intervened in an effort to weaken our democracy and to influence the outcome of one candidate against the other, Schiff alleged in a stiff but authoritative monotone he had perfected during his years as a prosecutor. Quote, the foreign adversary was, of course, Russia, and it acted through its intelligence agencies and on the instruction of its autocratic ruler, Vladimir Putin, in order to help Donald J. Trump become president of the United States, end quote. Invoking the term du jour of Russia-obsessed Democrats, quote, active measures, Schiff claimed that Russia's Federal Security Service, FSB, had stolen emails from the server of the Democratic National Committee, DNC, and hacked the email account of John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager. Then, according to Schiff, the FSB orchestrated a, quote, daily drip of damaging material through third-party hosting sites like WikiLeaks. Quote, it does not matter, end quote, whether the leaks proved decisive or even relevant in swinging the election to Trump, Schiff insisted, quote, what does matter is this, end quote. He said, building to a dramatic climax, quote, the Russians successfully meddled in our democracy and our intelligence agencies have concluded they will do so again, end quote. The ranking member of the Intelligence Committee proceeded to raise questions about whether U.S. citizens had colluded actively with the Russian government to influence the election in Trump's favor, or if bribery or blackmail had been a factor in Trump's decision-making toward Russia. With public sources, Schiff was able to demonstrate that several Trump advisors had met with Russian diplomats and done business with fellow oligarchs. But the evidence to support his most consequential claim that Russia had hacked the DNC server in a direct coordination with the Trump campaign was just that, a claim with no evidence to back it up. By this point, the Democrats were relying on a single source to demonstrate that Russian intelligence agents had hacked the DNC's email during the 2016 election. It was a private cybersecurity firm called CrowdStrike. The president of this firm, Sean Henry, was a former FBI executive assistant director and a paid cybersecurity consultant to NBC, the news channel. CrowdStrike's director, Dmitry some of these names, man, woof. I can say that because I'm like Eastern European. I can make fun of their last names without being mean. Dmitry Alperovich was a Russian exile working as a senior fellow at the Washington, D.C. based Atlantic Council. Oh, I have a lot of viewers. Hello, everyone. With heavy funding from NATO, weapons manufacturers like Raytheon, and Gulf monarchies from Saudi Arabia to Bahrain and Kuwait, the Atlantic Council had become a key proponent of military interventionism and anti-Russian fervor. Besides pumping up regime change in Syria and promoting Salafist insurgents as, quote, moderate rebels, the think tank hired a cadre of anti-Kremlin operatives like Alperovich, with financial support from Ukrainian oligarch Viktor Pinchuk. Again, I apologize if I'm pronouncing some of these names wrong. Pinchuk also happened to be a close associate of Bill Clinton and a top contributor to the Clinton Foundation. CrowdStrike laid out its findings on Russian hacking in a June 2016 report called, quote, Bears in the Midst. The paper's title referred to a hacking outfit called Fancy Bear, figuring it was a Kremlin asset the Russian government had used to hack the DNC's server. Fingering it as a Kremlin asset the Russian government had used to hack the DNC's server, CrowdStrike relied on entirely speculative claims authored in highly technical, authoritative language to support its dramatic conclusions. Its report was also filled with contradictory claims, asserting, for instance, that Fancy Bear's, quote, tradecraft is superb, end quote, though the supposed hacking group had been so sloppy, it left behind Cyrillic comments on the documents it disseminated online. Before the DNC hired CrowdStrike, Comey had sent, quote, multiple requests at different levels of the DNC for access to hacked email servers. Quote, the FBI repeatedly stressed to DNC officials the necessity of obtaining direct access to servers and data, only to be rebuffed until well after the initial compromise had been mitigated, end quote. An FBI official confirmed. With the FBI denied access to the DNC servers, the only source on the Russian government connection to the hack was CrowdStrike, though they were never given the DNC servers to directly examine. The Department of Homeland Security and the FBI reinforced CrowdStrike's attribution in reports declaring, quote, declaring, quote, high confidence in it. During his widely televised address before the House Intelligence Committee, Representative Schiff also turned to a dossier composed by former MI6 agent Christopher Steele to reinforce the narrative of Trump-Russia collusion. Marketed as a rock-solid piece of spycraft, the dossier was in fact the product of collaboration between the Clinton campaign and a private research firm, Fusion GPS, that employed Steele. The Clinton campaign had effectively paid for a collection of mostly unverified and salacious claims concerning Trump's relationship with the Russian government and about the evil intent of Russians in general. In fact, Steele had been recruited to produce the dossier by Jonathan Weiner, a former deputy assistant secretary in Hillary Clinton's State Department, who personally lobbied on behalf of Bill Browder and later helped the fugitive oligarch craft the Magnitsky Act. Weiner recounted supplying at least 120 private dossiers on Ukraine-related matters from Steele to State Department hands like Victoria Nuland since 2014. The document included the allegation that Trump had been secretly filmed by Russian intelligence services. This is where it gets interesting. I'm assuming. I mean, how could it not be? The document included the allegation that Trump had been secretly filmed by Russian intelligence services while being urinated on by sex workers at Ritz in Moscow, and that Putin was holding the video as kompromat, or blackmail, to keep the president in line. Delivered in a kind of clinical spook speak that John Le Carre fans would lapped up, John Le Carre, I think it's actually pronounced, fans lapped up and packed with enough salacious morsels for the tabloid press to feast on. The document read like a classic piece of gray propaganda. Once Clinton cut Steele loose during the campaign, Comey attempted to hire him to continue collecting dirt on Trump and Russia. The arrangement fell through when Steele violated FBI policy by feeding confidential information to the media. However, Comey had also inserted a confidential operative, veteran U.S. foreign policy analyst and CIA asset Stefan Halper, inside the Trump campaign to, quote, investigate the candidate's Russian ties. Meanwhile, the Steele dossier was used as the lone piece of evidence by a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act judge to justify authorizing the FBI to place the Trump campaign advisor Carter Page under FBI surveillance. Though Comey was forced to terminate Steele's contract a day before Trump's election in November 2016, Steele continued to communicate with the FBI through an agent named Bruce Ower, whose wife happened to work for Fusion GPS, the same research firm that had hired Steele. The week of Trump's inauguration, James Clapper arranged for the existence of the Steele dossier, including its most explosive contents, the so-called PP tape, to be leaked to CNN through some of the FBI's most trusted stenographers in the Beltway press corps. The story sent shockwaves through Washington and brought Trump's tense relationship with the intelligence directors to a boiling point. While liberals reveled in the president's embarrassment, Trump's right-wing base began to see him as a victim of the opaque, unelected, quote, deep state. Parentheses, Clapper was hired as an analyst by CNN soon after the I don't know what this word is. Imbroglio. Soon after the imbroglio. You're going to have to look that up. I don't know what that means. Eager to excuse the historically inept candidacy they had overseen, the dead enders of the Clinton campaign did all they could to reinforce the narrative of Trump-Russia collusion and the general atmosphere of the anti-Russian hostility. An insider account of the Clinton campaign published after her loss shattered confirmed that in the days after the election, Hillary Clinton declined to take responsibility for her own loss. Her top advisors were summoned in the following day, according to the book, quote, to engineer the case that the election wasn't entirely on the up and up. Already, Russian hacking was the centerpiece of the argument, end quote. 2 months later, Jennifer Palmieri, the communications director of Hillary Clinton's campaign, urged Democrats to push the narrative of Trump-Russia collusion, quote, relentlessly and above all else, end quote. Party leadership accepted the marching orders in total lockstep. Trump might have been the most immediate target of Russiagate, but the manufactured scandal had far-reaching consequences for America's political culture, and particularly for media outlets that diverged from the consensus narrative. A DNI report issued days after Trump entered office declared that a broad campaign of Russian interference had influenced the 2016 elections, yet asserted, quote, high confidence, end quote, in place of providing concrete evidence. In fact, 1/3 of the report was dedicated to content analysis of the Russian-backed English language news network RT, homing in on 2 shows that were no longer on air and accusing their hosts of spreading, quote, radical discontent, end quote. Soon after, the House and Senate Intelligence Committees initiated a series of stormy hearings on Russian interference, prompting the Department of Justice to force RT to register as a foreign agent. No other foreign state broadcaster was required to do the same under threat of arrest and prosecution. The front pages of trusted newspapers filled with stories sourced to unnamed U.S. officials alleging unproven acts of Russian sabotage against American voting systems, electricity grids, and even the minds of average Americans via Kremlin-directed, quote, active measures, end quote. The alleged Russian hacking of the DNC servers during the 2016 campaign was freely compared to Pearl Harbor and 9/11 by everyone from Hillary Clinton to Senator Ben Cardin. Russia hysteria dominated the coverage of 2 major anti-Trump cable networks, MSNBC and CNN, with top-rated MSNBC host Rachel Maddow dedicating more coverage to Russia than any other issue. Former intelligence agency higher-ups, former ex-CIA director John Brennan and Michael Hayden, to former DNI James Clapper were hired as network contributors, and by the end of 2017, books by these operatives and by James Comey on the Trump-Russia furor dominated bestseller lists. Under the influence of a cultural coup orchestrated by the national security state, American liberals united to defend some of the country's most conservative institutions against Trump's barrage of insults. The FBI, the, quote, intelligence community, and the corporate mainstream media emerged as their victim heroes, whilst NATO and the U.S.-dominated military alliance that had transformed Libya into a failed state, helped destabilize Afghanistan, and turned up tensions with Russia by expanding across Eastern Europe, each earned special protected status among those taken in by the Trump-Russia collusion narrative. In its obsession with Moscow's supposed meddling, the Democratic Party elite eagerly rehabilitated Bush-era neoconservatives, welcoming PNAC founder William Kristol and, quote, Axis of Evil author David Frum into the ranks of the so-called resistance. The Center for American Progress, the semi-official think tank of the Democratic Party, consolidated the liberal neocon alliance by forging a formal working relationship with American Enterprise Institute, the nest of the Iraq War neocons, to, quote, stand up to Russia. The narrative of Russiagate provided the national security state with all the political latitude it needed to carry out a long-standing goal that had previously been unworkable. Now, a top-down campaign to tame the online wilds where establishment media faced a stiff challenge from alternative independent news sources could be marketed to the general public as a crusade against fake news. In the first public appearance after losing to Trump, Hillary Clinton demanded that measures be taken against, quote, the epidemic of malicious fake news and the false propaganda that flooded social media over the past year, end quote. One of the many external factors she blamed for her defeat. The concept was assumed to encompass everything from phony clickbait sites to online conspiracism to virtually anything that offended elite sensibilities. Because mainstream media had failed to decide on a concrete definition of fake news, Trump was easily able to co-opt the term and turn it back on his enemies among the Beltway press corps. Elements in the national security state also seized the opportunity to clamp down on dissent. Soon after Trump's inauguration, a shadowy website called ProperNot mysteriously emerged with a blacklist of alternative media outlets, including many hubs of progressive left-wing opinion. ProperNot accused them of, quote, echoing Kremlin propaganda, end quote, and serving as platforms for Russian, quote, active measures. Epstein much? That's funny, I think. Not entirely sure what you mean. The Washington Post immediately picked up the site's blacklist and promoted it in a front-page feature. Hamilton 68. A similarly themed but more polished initiative backed by the German Marshall Fund followed up months later with a seemingly sophisticated dashboard that claimed to track the amplification of media sources and political issues by Russian bots. Though the dashboard developers refused to name a single bot account they tracked and eventually admitted that many bots were real people who were not even Russian, this initiative was treated as the gold standard in Russian, quote, active measures, monitoring by Congress and mainstream media. Meanwhile, the Atlantic Council in Washington, funded by NATO, the arms industry and Gulf allies, created its own special digital forensic research lab, DFR lab, unit to hunt down the Kremlin's most devious online influencers, despite its research as a misidentifying a British pensioner and a Ukrainian-American concert pianist as Russian bots. The DFR lab was hired in June 2018 by Facebook to purge its platform of digital evildoers. This meant that one of the most militaristic think tanks in DC, whose very existence was predicated on its ability to advance corporate and Western imperial interests around the globe, had been granted the ability to censor content on the private website that had come to represent America's digital commons. I'm gonna take a deep breath for a second. This goes on and on and on. How close are we? We're not too far. We've got about 14 pages left. And it's 9:19? Okay, we should be able to finish this. That's not a problem. To censor content on the private website that had come to represent America's digital commons. Throughout 2017, Silicon Valley executives were hauled before the Senate Intelligence Committee and pressured to cleanse their social media sites of Russian bots, trolls, and alternative media scofflaws. The first casualty of the centrist censorship campaign was the easiest target, Alex Jones. In the pages of of this book, Jones was seen channeling, in the pages of this book, Jones was seen channeling skepticism about the official story of the 9/11 attacks into a far-right cult of personality centered around himself. He eventually emerged as one of Trump's most potent grassroots allies and stalwart defenders. Amid the online purge, Jones and his archive were disappeared from almost every major social media platform, from YouTube to Pinterest to Facebook. His archives were simply erased under government pressure. Democratic Senator Chris Murphy suggested that Jones would not be the last voice silenced by the establishment. Quote, "These companies must do more to take down one website. Must do more than take down one website," end quote. Murphy declared, quote, "The survival of our democracy depends on it," end quote. Soon enough, leftist outlets, including Telesur, the Latin American socialist-oriented broadcaster, were forced to fight to reinstate their Facebook pages following arbitrary takedowns. Russiagate had provided the national security state with the convenient lever for reasserting its authority over the national discourse, but its underlying narrative of America under siege reflected mounting frustration with the reality of America's waning influence on the global stage. The fraying of the hegemonic American project was most pronounced in Syria, where Washington's multi-billion-dollar covert arm and equip operation had collapsed in the face of a combined intervention by Russia and Iran. After Iraq and Libya, Syria was supposed to have been next to fall under Western military pressure, but by calling on its allies and effectively mobilizing its own resources, the government in Damascus managed to hold on. The reaction in Washington's national security circles was predictably overwrought. By 2017, ISIS was well on its way to defeat the quote, regions of savagery, end quote, it had carved out in northeastern Syria from Raqqa to Deir ez-Zor, I think, were rapidly caving under pressure from the Syrian military, Russian air support, and U.S.-backed Kurdish forces. Meanwhile, Syria and its allies were pulverizing the Islamist insurgents, suffering from dwindling foreign support. President Assad was winning the diplomatic war as well, having extracted an official reversal on March 30th of Washington's policy from U.S. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley and the then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who each declared that the United States would no longer seek regime change in Syria. A scheduled April 5th gathering of Western diplomats in Brussels to plan reconstruction efforts represented another significant diplomatic victory for Damascus. Still, insurgents held an important card in the form of the, quote, red line, end quote, policy enacted by the Obama administration back in 2013. According to the red line, the Syrian government could be plausibly accused of deploying chemical weapons in any form. The Trump administration would have to provide military intervention. At that same time, the Syrian army closed in on rebel strongholds. U.S. intervention was the insurgents' only hope to stave off a total defeat. Like clockwork, just 48 hours before diplomats convened in Brussels, images and allegations began to pour through Syrian opposition's new social media channels depicting a calamitous attack on a rebel-held territory. According to the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, a one-man operation based in England and funded by the British Foreign Office, on April 3, 2017, some 60 civilians were killed in an apparent chemical weapon attack on Khan Shakun, a town within the Idlib governorate. Since 2015, Idlib had been under the control of Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria, known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Immediately, photos emerged in the media of members of the U.S. and UK-funded white helmets splashing water on withering children piled on the back of a pickup truck, an unusual procedure for treatment of sarin victims. Other outlets showed the white helmets treating victims without gloves, a procedure that would have exposed rescuers to sarin had it indeed been deployed. No munitions were ever produced. The only visual evidence of a chemical-based airstrike was a photograph of a single crater in the road of Khan Shakun. The impact of these gut-wrenching viral images of dead children was immediate, sparking outrage across the globe and renewing demands for regime change from Western capitals. At an April 5th press conference in the White House's Rose Garden, one reporter after another pushed Trump to bomb. Quote, do you feel like you bear the responsibility for responding to chemical attacks? And does the chemical attack cross a red line for you? End quote. Julie Pace of the Associated Press asked Trump. How's that for irony? Will you go after them? What message will you give them today? Will you work with Russians to ground the Syrian Air Force and establish safe zones? End quote. Another reporter asked. Trump seemed lost, babbling incoherently about ISIS while slamming the Iran nuclear deal. The same reporter kept up the pressure. Quote, but sir, I'm talking about the Iranian militias in Syria supporting the Syrian regime, separate of the nuclear deal. What message do you have for them today? End quote. Quote, you will see, end quote, Trump declared. Quote, they will have a message. You will see what the message will be, end quote. Behind the scenes, Trump's foreign policy was increasingly under the management of a cast of former four-star generals who comprised much of his national security inner circle. Meanwhile, his daughter Ivanka Trump approached him with the photos of dead children in Khan Shaykhun to ratchet up the pressure for military intervention. The first daughter was heartbroken and outraged, quote, heartbroken and outraged by the images. According to her brother, quote, Ivanka is a mother of 3 children and she has influence. I'm sure she said, listen, this is horrible stuff. My father will act in times like that, end quote, said presidential son Eric Trump. It crossed a lot of lines for me, end quote, President Trump said of the images. Quote, when you kill innocent children, innocent babies with a chemical gas that is so lethal that people were shocked to hear what gas it was, that crosses many, many lines, beyond red lines, many, many times, end quote. And I'd just like to point out that there are dead children who have been dying from white phosphorus and getting poisoned by white phosphorus in Gaza since like at least 2016, possibly before. So, you know, on the evening of April 5th, at his resort, on the evening of April 5th, at his resort in Mar-a-Lago, Trump authorized the launch of 59 cruise missiles from 2 naval destroyers parked in the Mediterranean. Their target was Shayrat Air Base, a central node of the Syrian military's operations, where airstrikes against ISIS held territory in Palmyra and even far off Deir ez-Zor had been launched. Whether the base had any role in the chemical attack on Khan Shaykhun was still unknown. Trump's bombing run won high praise from the military humanists who had been behind some of Obama's administration's most catastrophic regime change operations. Quote, Donald Trump has done the right thing on Syria. Finally, after years of useless hand-wringing in the face of hideous atrocities, Anne-Marie Slaughtert declared. I don't know how to say that. And it sounds like slaughtered. It looks like slaughtered, but it's a little different. Nicholas Kristof, the New York Times columnist who boasted NATO's intervention in Libya and advocated for another war of regime change in Syria, proclaimed, quote, Trump is right to make the Syria pay a price for war crimes, and taking out airfields is the best approach, end quote. His only concern, he said, was in Trump's, quote, execution. Yikes. Continuing, during Israel's 2014 assault on the Gaza Strip, the reliably pro-interventionist Kristof complained that, quote, too many Palestinians define nonviolence to include rock throwing. No, that doesn't cut it. Having clashed openly with media he had referred to as, quote, an enemy of the people, end quote, Trump suddenly found cheerleaders in newsrooms across the country. Out of 47 major newspaper editorial boards, only one, the Houston Chronicle, opposed Trump's airstrikes on Syria, while the Washington Post's David Ignatius, that's actually his last name, a reliable barometer of national security state opinion, lauded Trump for, quote, moving slightly towards pillars of traditional foreign policy, end quote. CNN described Trump as leaning towards a moderate voice, end quote. The network's leading foreign policy analyst Fareed Zakaria exalted the bombing, exclaiming that, quote, Donald Trump became president of the United States last night. I think this was a big moment, end quote. Zakaria echoed his colleague at CNN, liberal commentator Van Jones, who said 2 months earlier that Trump, quote, became president, end quote, when he honored the widow of a Navy SEAL killed in a botched Special Forces raid that left as many as 25 civilians dead in Yemen. Wow. Jake Tapper, the CNN anchor who had positioned himself as Trump's arch antagonist joined the war party. On Twitter, Tapper quoted a, quote, Syrian activist who texted him to exclaim, "Finally, thank God," end quote. The following day, CNN revealed the identity of that activist, who was Moaz Mustafa, the State Department funded opposition lobbyist who helped drive the failed campaign for U.S. military intervention in Syria back in 2013, and who took Senator John McCain on his illegal trip to Syria, where the senator posed for an embarrassing photo op with two insurgents accused of kidnapping Shia pilgrims. Fun. Trump's bombing earned praise from even more unlikely quarters. On the private Telegram channels, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Syrian Salafi insurgent groups Ahrar al-Sham cheered on the president and demanded more missile strikes. In Al-Qaeda-controlled Idlib, a local falafel salesman renamed his shop after Trump, while Syrian opposition supporters took to social media to hail the president. The arch-Islamophobe author of the discriminatory travel ban targeting Muslims by nicknaming him Abu Ivanka al-Ameriki. Wow. Among the isolated voices of criticism was one of the world's most experienced weapons inspectors, Hans Blix. As the former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Blix attempted to investigate existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq had been sabotaged by Bush's invasion. In Syria, he saw history repeating itself. Quote, I don't know whether Washington they presented any evidence, but I did not see any in the Security Council. End quote. Blix complained that German outlet Deutsche Welle, quote, merely pictures of victims that were held up. The whole world can see with horror. Such pictures are not necessarily evidence of who did it, end quote. Blaming an emotionally charged atmosphere for Trump's impulsive decision, Blix asked, quote, if you had a murder and you strongly suspect one fellow, do you go to the judgment and execution straight away, 3 days after the murder, end quote? No major American or British news outlet covered Blix's critical comments. The rare swell of positive reinforcement from elements which seemed dedicated to Trump's undoing fulfilled the president's almost animalistic yearning for approval. He seemed so overcome with self-satisfaction that he was able to remember that he was eating at the time of the missile strike better than the name of the country he had just bombed. Quote, I wish I was sitting at the table. We had just finished dinner, end quote. He recalled in a bizarre interview with Maria Bartiromo of Fox News. Quote, we're now having dessert, and we had one of the most beautiful pieces of chocolate cake you've ever seen, and Chinese President Xi was enjoying it, end quote. Trump continued, his face ruddy with delight. Quote, so what happens is, I said, quote, we've just launched 59 missiles heading to Iraq, and I wanted you to know this, and Xi was eating his cake, and he was silent. Just, as a side note, Xi Jinping has never dropped any bombs on any countries. He's never done anything of the sort. Anyways, towards Syria, Bartiromo interjected, correcting the president. Yes, heading towards Syria. He said Iraq. That's hilarious. Trump sheepishly conceded, quickly returning to a detailed play-by-play of how Xi finished his dessert. He do be eating cake, though. Though Trump might have been ignorant of the international implications of the missile strike or even where the missiles landed, he seemed accurately aware of the domestic political benefits of bombing a Russian ally. Under constant fire from Russia, baiting Democrats in Congress and the Beltway press corps, Trump had found an opportunity to co-opt their narrative. Quote, if Russia didn't go in and back this animal, you wouldn't have the problem you have now, end quote. He told Fox Business, referring to Assad in the most derogatory terms he could muster. Eric Trump echoed his father's attempt to push back at the narrative of Russiagate, insisting, quote, if there was anything that attacking Syria did, it was to validate the fact that there is no Russia tie, end quote. The day after the missile strikes, cable news producers were like putty in the hands of the national security state. The Pentagon piped footage of Tomahawk launches from the Pentagon to the American public through CNN, while primetime panels filled with former generals and ex-intelligence agents. Brian Williams, this MSNBC anchor who had been suspended from his job for fabricating a dramatic war story about surviving a fusillade of RPG fire from insurgents during a helicopter flight over Iraq was overcome with almost an erotic exuberance as he commented on the Pentagon supplied video of the missile launch, quote, "I am guided by the beauty of our weapons," end quote. Williams gushed, quoting a Leonard Cohen lyric from a piece the singer-songwriter once described as, quote, "a terrorist song." Once the national media finally completed its love bombing of Trump, the Syrian military resumed sorties from the Shayrat Air Base, still intact despite salvos of cruise missiles. Hoping to seize the moment, the national security state's most radical elements dusted off a well-worn blueprint and channeled its soda voce through the pundit who represented one of their most trusted ciphers. Quote, "backing off fighting territorial ISIS," end quote, and instead harness the jihadist group as a proxy to, quote, "bleed Russia," end quote, Iran and the Syrian government. Thomas Friedman urged the New York Times. Okay, I'm going to reread that since I botched that sentence. Quote, "backing off fighting territorial ISIS," end quote, and instead harness the jihadist group as a proxy to, quote, "bleed," end quote, Russia, Iran, and the Syrian government, Thomas Friedman urged the New York Times. Advising Washington against defeating ISIS, Friedman demanded massive arms shipments to the moderate rebels in Idlib and a no-fly zone to protect them. That's, quote, moderate rebels, by the way. And a no-fly zone to protect them. Either unaware or unconcerned that the area was under the iron grip of the local franchise of Al-Qaeda. Friedman pointed to the covert war initiated by the CIA in 1978 in Afghanistan as his blueprint. Quote, "in Syria, Trump should let ISIS be Assad's, Iran's, Hezbollah's, and Russia's headache, the same way he encouraged the Mujahideen fighters to bleed Russia in Afghanistan," end quote. As deranged as Friedman's prescription might have seemed, it was hardly different than the policy Washington had put in place when it began arming the insurgency in 2012. Washington's meddling had produced the birth of the ISIS caliphate across wide swaths of Iraq and Syria, along with the rise of the largest Al-Qaeda franchise since 9/11. For average people across the Middle East, this proxy war compounded the agony of the invasion of Iraq to an unbearable degree. For the managers of savagery in Washington, however, the destabilizing impact of the semi-covert policy had been a boon, enabling fragmentation of the previously stable and secular state that had obstructed American and Israeli designs on the region. 7 years later, though Syria had finally begun reconstitute itself, the country bore all the scars of a world war played out on a miniature scale. Military personnel from Russia and Iran lay scattered across the regions of government control, while Turkey had taken de facto possession of Idlib and was on its way toward invading and occupying Afrin, a mostly Kurdish area in northern Syria. Israel continued to harass the country, using the Iranian presence as a pretext to launch attacks deep inside Syrian territory. Meanwhile, the United States held on to a tenuous presence in the northeast, embedding thousands of troops among Kurdish fighters and entrenching itself in the oil-rich region despite having completed its mission against ISIS. A July 2018 report by the UN Security Council's Sanctions Monitoring Team implicitly accused the United States of giving ISIS, quote, "breathing space," end quote, in order to justify prolonging the American military's presence. The Russian and Iranians had been invited guests of the Syrian government, and Turkey was a regional neighbor, though not necessarily a friendly one. However, President Assad stated that in no uncertain terms that the Americans were unwelcome, quote, "invaders," end quote, and the three major players, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, negotiated over Syria's future at the Sochi peace talks. The United States stood on the sidelines, rumbling idle threats alongside its monarchic Gulf partners. Washington was clearly the odd man out. While Trump appeared to recognize this reality, he would have to overcome the iron opposition of a firmly entrenched national security state to do anything about it. During April 3rd, 2018, During an April 3rd, 2018 White House meeting exactly a year after after the Khan Shaykhun incident, Trump clashed with his defense secretary, Jim Mad Dog Mattis, General Joseph Dunford, the chief of Pentagon Central Command, and an assorted group of Pentagon officials over Syria. When the president proposed an immediate withdrawal of U.S. troops from the country, Mattis and the generals pushed back, citing unspecified, quote, residual pockets of Islamic State fighters, end quote. How long do you need to do that? A frustrated Trump complained. I called him Crump. A frustrated Trump complained. The generals refused to provide a clear timeline. It appeared as though they favored a near-permanent U.S. presence, possibly to keep the oil wells in Syria's northeast in American custody. The stormy meeting resembled a confrontation that occurred months earlier between Trump and his national security team over Afghanistan, where the president erupted in a stream of profanities against the general's plan for a massive surge of U.S. troops. With only the ultra-nationalist aide Steve Bannon on his side, Trump found himself cornered. In a matter of days, the generals had secured their plans for a major escalation in Afghanistan, and Bannon had unceremoniously drummed out, completing the purge of Trump's inner circle of loyalists. Yeah, bye-bye Bannon. Among the president's right-wing constituent base, events like these fueled the perception that a, quote, deep state, end quote, of elected national security operatives had systematically sabotaged the president's non-interventionist, quote, America first, end quote, agenda and supplanted it with a, quote, globalist, end quote, consensus favored by cosmopolitan elites in the mainstream media. Given the rapidly shifting tenor of the president's rhetoric and the composition of his foreign policy team, the perception was understandable. Trump's inner circle had been overtaken by hardline militarists like John Bolton, the national security advisor who favored military campaigns from Iran to North Korea, and former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, a marionette in the hands of neoconservatives who treated the UN as a grand stage to inveigh against Iran and Russia. Under the watch of the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, an evangelical zealot and anti-Iran hardliner, neoconservative retreats were filling up mid-level posts. In just over a year, the Trump administration was beginning to resemble the second coming of George W. Bush's first term. Back in Syria, final pockets of Salafi jihadi insurgency, the final pockets of Salafi jihadi insurgencies were being steamrolled by the Syrian army with Russian and Iranian military assistance. The strongest insurgent holdout lay in East Ghouta, an area in the suburbs of Damascus that had been used as a staging point for constant mortar attacks on the Syrian capital and even attempts to down civilian airliners taking off from a nearby airport. Jaish al-Islam, the Army of Islam, had established a hardliner Islamist fiefdom in the area, relying on arms and untold millions in funding from Saudi Arabia. But as the Syrian army closed in, Jaish al-Islam foreign backing collapsed, forcing its leadership to hash out a series of deals that enabled its evacuation. Now, the only remaining pocket of resistance lay in the adjacent suburb of Douma, where the hardline faction refused to accept any bargaining with Damascus. Its defeat was imminent. On April 7th, just 4 days after Trump's confrontation with the generals over pulling U.S. troops out of Syria, a new wave of videos and photos came tumbling in from familiar opposition media channels alleging that a chemical attack had taken place. As before, concrete evidence was non-existent. Western media consumers were simply asked to accept on faith that photographs of lifeless women and children in a basement and videos of children being hosed off by white helmet personnel constituted a chemical attack. They were also expected to shut off their critical faculties and avoid asking why Syria's armed opposition alleged a chemical attack seemingly whenever it was on the brink of a major defeat. In the hypercharged atmosphere of Russiagate, where any prominent opinion maker who questioned the wisdom of the revamped Cold War or challenged Washington's hostility toward Moscow could be branded a traitor, skeptics of the official narrative of Douma were swiftly dismissed as conspiracists, or worse, as Kremlin agents. Hours after the chemical allegations emerged, Trump mustered the most cartoonishly menacing threat he could conceive, vowing that, quote, Animal Assad would pay a, quote, big price for the attack. His tirade was followed by a volley of 126 cruise missiles from the deck of a U.S. warship stationed in the Mediterranean. They struck at targets like Barzeh Science Research Laboratory, which international inspectors from the OPCW had inspected a year prior and determined to be a civilian science research facility with no chemical weapons on site. Hours later, Mattis emerged before the Washington press corps to announce the immediate end of operations. The attack was a largely symbolic strike carried out from the distance and aimed as much at the American public opinion as it was at, quote, a rogue nation, end quote. In that respect, it was positively Clintonian, calling the U.S. cruise missile on. I do have dyslexia, yes, actually. Thanks for asking. Can you speak up, please? My audio is very quiet. I thought I was yelling. I apologize if it's not coming in properly. I am dyslexic, though, so that might explain some of my stumbles. Anyways, continuing. Let me find my spot. The attack was a largely symbolic strike carried out from a distance and aimed as much at the American public opinion as it was at a, quote, rogue nation, end quote. In that respect, it was positively Clintonian, recalling the U.S. cruise missile in the Al-Shifa medical factory in 1998 that wiped out much of Sudan's supply of pharmaceutical drugs in the name of retaliating against bin Laden. Interventionist pundits spent days shrieking about Trump's failure to dent the, quote, Assad regime, end quote. But with Russia and Iran's militaries fully invested in guaranteeing Syria's survival, there was little the United States could do toward that end without risking a devastating regional conflagration. Once again, America's national security state had been checkmated on the world stage. We are just about done. Oh, okay. You have dyslexia too. That's cool. Dyslexics unite, man. What's up? Well, I don't know if you're a man. Whatever you are. Khan Shaykhun, the town in Al-Qaeda dominated Idlib, where a chemical attack was alleged to have taken place, had remained off limits to international inspectors and journalists. However, the liberation of Douma and East Ghouta from insurgent control provided an unprecedented opportunity for outside investigation. When the veteran Middle East correspondent for the UK Independent, Robert Fisk, visited Douma, he met a local doctor who insisted that no chemical attack had occurred, but that the Islamist gunmen who occupied the area exploited the destruction of conventional bombings to create the appearance of one. A reporter from the conservative American network OAN named Pearson Sharp visited the local hospital and heard the same story from local doctors. Quote, the rebels were desperate and they needed a ploy to get the Syrian army off of their backs so they could escape, end quote. The most illuminating testimony came from Hassan Diab, a local boy who appeared in widely disseminated footage being frantically hosed down by insurgent-affiliated medical staff. Quote, we were outside and they told all of us to go into the hospital. I was immediately taken upstairs and they started pouring water on me. End quote. Diab recalled to one reporter from RT Arabic, quote, the doctors started filming us here in the hospital. They were pouring water and taking videos, end quote. Diab's father complained that his son had been stripped and sprayed with cold water despite suffering no injuries from any chemical weapons, that he had been used as a stage prop to convince Westerners that the red line had been crossed. Though other eyewitnesses, including doctors from the Douma Hospital, confirmed Diab's testimony in a press conference at The Hague, Western pundits dismissed their words entirely on the grounds that the Russian Foreign Ministry had organized the press meeting. But a preliminary report by the OPCW on the Douma attack provided further credence to the skeptics of the official line. Unlike the OPCW's report on the incident in Khan Shaykhun, which found that a nerve agent had been used, but which relied on partisan third parties linked to insurgents to deliver biomedical samples, the investigation into Douma was conducted with a full chain of custody. The report found that no nerve agents had been present and found no chlorine in the biomedical samples it took from supposed victims on site. The only thing inspectors discovered was, quote, various chlorinated organic chemicals, end quote, the kind of substances that could originate from ordinary household cleaners and swimming pools. Tellingly, findings that suggested the West has waged another military operation on the basis of a deception were scarcely reported by the same media outlets that had blared news of a chemical attack with near total certainty. The New York Times had even sought to reinforce the official narrative by hiring a cartoonist to dramatize a chemical attack in Duma. The paper marketed its article as, quote, augmented reality, end quote. No organization had been more instrumental than the White Helmets in supplying the mood music for Western military intervention. Treated as neutral lifesavers imbued with the spirit of Gandhi in the Western mainstream media, nominated for a Nobel Prize, awarded an Oscar for a Netflix documentary propagandizing on their behalf, the White Helmets were, in fact, an influence operation funded to the tune of at least $90 million by the U.S. State Department and the British Foreign Office. They were also party to the conflict, having been embedded among virtually every faction of the armed opposition, including ISIS, and filmed participating in grisly public executions. Since their creation in southern Turkey in 2014 by a former British military officer and information warfare specialist named James Lamazure, the White Helmets had served as the go-to source for Western correspondents seeking dramatic footage of the civil servants extracting children from the rubble. Which we have actual like grassroots footage of happening in Gaza. Not a lot of talk about that. While parading in public as lifesavers, White Helmet leaders lobbied Congress for sanctions in Syria and pleaded for Western military intervention. But one insurgent pocket after another collapsed across Syria. This internationally famous and assiduously whitewashed organization rapidly shed its usefulness. In July 2018, following the defeat of Islamist insurgents in South Syria, including ISIS factions, 422 self-identified White Helmet members were evacuated by the Israeli military through the occupied Golan Heights to Jordan, a U.S. client state that had served as a base for covert operations against Syria's government. The war may not have been entirely over, but this event signaled more than any other the campaign to shatter Syria as an independent nation-state was close to its end. Not only had the White Helmets been treated to special evacuation not afforded to any other Syrians in distress, it had arrived courtesy of Israel, a malicious adversary whose very existence was opposed across the Arab world. Nothing could have better enforced the critique of this group as a collection of cynical mercenaries and of the Syrian armed opposition as a whole than this scene of retreat. Yeah, no pipeline in Gaza. Interesting. That's a comment for those curious. That's not a quote from the book. Consumed in bitterness over its failure in Syria, America's national security state lashed out with vengeful fury. Biting sanctions were crafted to target Russia for its role in preventing regime change in Syria. Meanwhile, the Trump administration reoriented its national security doctrine toward what Defense Secretary Mattis called, quote, great power conflict, end quote, with Russia and China. The new doctrine did not even mention ISIS or any, quote, war on terror. A budget-busting defense authorization bill appropriately named for the Senator John McCain ratified the drive toward confrontation with Russia and China, removing congressional oversight from the production of nuclear weapons and demanding a, quote, whole-of-government, end quote, strategy against China. The bill also widened the military's latitude for action against Iran, which the Trump administration had just placed back on the regime change target board after unilaterally reneging on the nuclear deal the United States had signed with Tehran. Under heavy influence from pro-Israel oligarchs like Sheldon Adelson and think tank, who is dead now, like Sheldon Adelson and the think tanks he's funded, the Trump administration established a special, quote, Iran action group, end quote, to spearhead the State Department's campaign of pressure and sabotage. The new anti-Iran unit distinctly resembled the George W. Bush Pentagon's Office of Special Plans, the propaganda operation set up by neoconservative operative Douglas Feith to cook up intelligence linking Saddam Hussein to al-Qaeda. Below the radar of the Washington press corps, Feith's son David had been hired to work directly under the Iran Action Group's director, Brian Hook. Through covert operations and overt invasions, America's national security state had destabilized entire regions from the Levant to North Africa, unleashed a migration crisis of unprecedented proportions into Europe, and spurred an inevitable right-wing backlash that was unraveling the neoliberal consensus they had sought to protect. This process had crashed against the hard rocks of the reality in Syria, and with it, the unipolar bliss that America had briefly enjoyed after the Cold War began to evaporate. As a new order emerged, Russiagate had become the ultimate expression of the national security state's anxieties. Just one day before Trump's scheduled summit in Helsinki, Special Counsel Robert Mueller released the most dramatic document in his 18-month-long federal investigation into Trump's relationship with Russia, it was a detailed indictment of 12 Russian officers of the Military Intelligence Unit, GRU, accusing them of hacking into the DNC's computers to disrupt the 2016 presidential campaign. The timing of the incident ensured that Trump would be met with the furor of the Washington press corps, tailing him to Helsinki with one question another about collusion with Putin and compromise, and zero questions about substantive issues like anti-ballistic missile negotiations or de-escalation in Syria, because the accused intelligence officers were likely to never appear in court. Mueller's charges couldn't be proven. When another group of Russians accused Mueller of interfering in the 2016 election through the Internet Research Agency, online troll farm did appear in court. He rejected their request for discovery and frustratingly passed the case off to other attorneys. However, the contents of the special counsel's indictment were enough to convict Trump in the eyes of the national security state. Quote, "He is wholly in the pocket of Putin," end quote, former CIA Director Brennan declared following the Helsinki summit with Putin. Brennan added that Trump's performance was, quote, "nothing short of treasonous," end quote. By painting Trump as a Putin's puppet and branding anyone who favored detente with Russia as treacherous, the national security establishment rallied to the public behind the diplomatic degradation, all-out hostility, and budget-busting defense expenditures. And by reviving the anti-communist paranoia of the Cold War, Russiagate enabled smear campaigns against socialist challengers like the UK Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn, an anti-war stalwart, and even Bernie Sanders, who presented only a faint challenge to the foreign policy consensus. In the face of their own failure, America's national security elites had successfully engineered a new Cold War, wagering that the reignited conflict would preserve their management of savagery abroad and postpone the terrible reckoning they deserved at home. In July 2018, a review of the Manchester bombing found that the British national security apparatus had been more intimately involved in the activities of the Abedis than previously believed. 4 years earlier, during the height of the Libyan civil war, in which both Ramadan and Salman Abedi acted as foreign fighters, the Royal Navy's HMS Enterprise docked in Tripoli and welcomed both men abroad, along with some 100 others. They were escorted to Malta and then flown back to the UK. A month before he was ferried home to the UK, Salman Abdi had been removed from a security services watch list. What were the two men doing in Libya at the time, and why were they sent home without a second thought? The questions were scarcely engaged with the British press, which reporting the Royal Navy's suspect sea lift in passing, and with little to no follow-up, branding it as a, quote, rescue operation. The West wars in the Middle East were drawing to an ignominious close by this point. From Washington to London, the so-called war on terror no longer generated the same level of public hysteria or paychecks it once had. But as the dust cleaned from the 2 decades of regime change campaigns, a new cast of evildoers was coming into focus. The end. That was cool. A lot to read there. I'm sorry I tripped over so much. It's, it's late. I'm dyslexic, etc. I hope you enjoyed that. This is The Management of Savagery by Max Blumenthal. You can purchase it at numerous locations. I suggest buying it from Verso Books. That is the best location to purchase it from. Yeah, power to the people.